Why do King James Onlyists fail? That's the question at the title of this video, and this is brought about by the recent debate with James White and Jack Moorman. Jack Moorman being the King James Onlyist, James White being a critic of King James Onlyism. And I've been checking around and getting other people's reactions, and even those who are themselves King James Onlyists pretty much are in agreement that Moorman got trounced. It was pretty badly. It got to the question. It got to the question that they were giving various reasons, as were the people who were critics of King James Onlyism, and I've noticed some of them actually tie into a common theme. That a lot of the pointed criticisms tie into a common theme, and that's that King James Onlyism is really very much locked in the past. That in a sense, it has not availed itself of all the information. It is intentionally limiting itself to a particular period of time. It treats the question of Bible translations or textual evidence as it stood in the late 19th century, when the debate was between Westcott and Hort versus Steenbergen and others, and it's placing the emphasis on that conversation and assuming that when they use terms like Alexandrian and Byzantine, etc., that they're treating them the same way that they mean the same thing that they do now. And none of this is the case. And they just don't seem aware of it and don't seem to get it. They don't seem to be aware of things that happened in the 20th century, such as when people finally started really cataloging the majority text. It turned out to be much different than the Textus Receptus. And they treat the two as though they're interchangeable. And things like that, on and on. They're stuck in the 19th century. And it's kind of amusing. There was a couple points in the debate, which I think kind of acts as a metaphor for the entire conflict. And it wasn't anything, but necessarily to do with the items, just the way they approached things, the way they presented things. There was one point where James White, during some of the question and answer segments, was making a point, and actually it happened, I think, also a few other places, where he would just flip up his iPad and just bring things up on the screen, and it would be very clear, and it all seemed very natural. James White is obviously used to using this technology, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, when Moorman was trying to answer something, he'd be flipping through papers. Oh, I got to answer some here. Wait a minute. And this, to me, that almost acted as a metaphor for the entire conflict. That one side has moved on to use one side is still locked in the past, and the other has moved on. But the fact is that more, as I pointed out when I did an analysis of Moorman's presentation, he really is locked into a 19th century framework. He doesn't understand the debate has moved on considerably since then. For example, when he pointed to the Scrivener text as representing those thousands of manuscripts, and it obviously doesn't. That would be something like the Robinson-Pierpont or the Hodges Farstad. It's astonishing to me that they're still making this argument. Here we are. Everyone knows this, and he's treating. And this, of course, was part of his key, his Mount Impassable. And it just seems as though there's blind. They put themselves in this box. They mainly talk to each other. The only new people they get in are people who are basically uninformed that are learning everything from them. You rarely, if ever, find someone who's really well informed on the text who becomes a King James Onlyist. Now, some of them may become, say, a majority text proponent, but you rarely see them become, because they know better. If they're aware of the Greek text, they're not going to be King James Onlyists. If they have any familiarity. So it to me, this just stuck as so obvious. And one thing that was brought up, I've seen brought up, and I think there's a lot to say for this, is that someone like Moorman and other King James Onlyist proponents, who are not total jerks, and Moorman is not a jerk. There are King James Onlyists who are just full of bluster, like the Ruckmans and like that, and they'll just say anything, and they don't really care if it has any basis in reality at all. They'll just, build it out, make things up, come up with these wild conspiracy theories, etc. And people like that they're just more or less playing for their own audience. But Moorman obviously is someone who seems to want to believe this and is trying to be scholarly about it, but he's just, what happens is when people like that who travel among Kings, what they're used to is going into an environment where basically you've got King James Onlyists there, and they talk to them, and they tell them what they want to hear, and everybody nods, and nobody asks him any questions, and nobody questions anything he says, and so he's locked into that, whereas White, of course, as we know, has debated a lot of people and is used to conflict, and is engaged in, and whether you like him or hate him, he's obviously engaged in this issue. Whereas Moorman really doesn't interact, and he obviously doesn't interact with the opponents, because he would have some answer, or he would have anticipated some answer to the difference between the majority text and Textus Receptus, or the Scrivener text, which he he just avoided. And on and on. And then there were numerous questions that were put to him. In fact, at one point, the moderator had to repeat the question because he just basically walked around it, skipped around it, just did anything to avoid answering direct questions. So, this, I think, is very telling, that they really just don't pick up the other end of the debate, and why you see them repeating the same things over and over, even though, and he treats this as, quote, Mount Impassable, when in fact every argument he made has been dispelled many, many times. They've all been refuted. Nothing he presented that evening had any basis in reality. It's just amazing, and he seems like a nice enough guy, honestly, but it's just, he's so divorced from the actual state of the debate. He's locked into. I know when he's reading, he's still locked into Dean Bergen and the state of the debate in the late 1800s, which of course is irrelevant at this point, because nobody really agrees with either of them. So either side at that stage of the debate. There's a lot of information that has been learned in the last century or more, many, many more manuscripts. And when they use terms like Alexandrian and Byzantine, they don't mean the same thing as when Westcott Hort and Bergen used them. And that's where there's just this disconnect with reality. And I pointed it out in videos, but it still amazes me that Moorman is still basically beating the same drum, even though everything he said has, in fact, been answered. Everything he asked has been answered many, many times. He just doesn't want to hear them. Thank you very much for your time.